Hello there. Today I'm continuing my look at some wines from the 1999 vintage, and this is in celebration of the fact that this year Wine Searcher is 25 years old. So the wine I'm looking at today is from a wine region called Matakana, and Matakana is fairly local to where our offices are in Auckland. Matakana lies about an hour's drive north of Auckland. It's on the east coast, and the vineyards here are about a couple of kilometres inland from the sea. So there's a relatively warm or a subtropical climate here, but climate that's tempered by proximity to the ocean. So we're in the Rodney Hills, the set of rolling hills. The vineyard here is about 400 metres above sea level. Being on the east coast, there's relatively low rainfall. The climate is subtropical, so we get quite good sunshine hours here. The vineyard here was planted in 1990 by somebody called James Vuletic, and James is still the owner and the winemaker today. I would assume, given his surname, that James's ancestry is Croatian, and that is fairly typical for a lot of the wineries in the Auckland area. There's quite a large Croatian community in Auckland, and they've had a very large impact on the development of New Zealand's wine industry. When the vineyard was planted here in 1990, the varieties chosen were all Bordeaux varieties. The majority of plantings were Merlot, about 70% Merlot, and actually Merlot had only come to New Zealand probably about 20 years beforehand. It's not a variety that had been growing here for particularly long at that stage. The balance of the plantings are about 20% Cabernet Franc and 10% Malbec. In reaction to the wines that have been produced, James has actually changed the planting, and these days there's more like sort of 45% Merlot, 45% Cabernet Franc, and the Malbec stays at 10% of the plantings. But I would assume that this wine, being from just 9 years after the vineyard was planted, that it would be a Merlot predominant wine. The vineyard is not huge, it's 2 hectares, it's a north-facing vineyard with something like a 12-degree slope. Soils here are free-draining volcanic clays. Actually, they work very well because in general they don't hold enough water, and so they allow the vines to have a little bit of stress, which helps the vine to ripen its fruit. However, these are sort of 6 metre deep clays, and so they will hold a certain amount of water, but the water reserves are often deep down, and that forces the vine to create a deep root system to go and find those water reserves. But even in dry years, there is some water available in the soils for the plant. 1999 was, case in point, was actually quite a peculiar vintage. There'd been a very dry winter and spring, and so flowering went ahead really well. It happened quickly and consistently. However, the summer here was strange in that there were high levels of cloud and pretty high humidity, and yet there wasn't very much rainfall. So what actually resulted was that the grapes ripened slowly, they developed good flavours, good tannins. They didn't develop particularly high sugar levels, but when it came to picking in April, the grapes were phenolically ripe. So it was a bit of an unusual vintage. Picking here is entirely done by hand, and they wait until after 10:30 in the morning to make sure there's no dew remaining on the plant that might dilute the wine. And waiting until 10:30 also enables the fruit to warm up, and that's useful in the winery because the fruit is at optimum temperature to start fermenting if it's relatively warm when it arrives there. There isn't a long transport to the winery. Everything is pretty much crushed within an hour of being picked, so there's not a chance of deterioration in the grapes becoming overheated during transport. The grapes are picked into 8-kilogram bins, and careful selections employed. This is done by hand, and obviously they're getting rid of sort of sticks and leaves and matter other than grapes are removed, but they're also getting rid of unripe fruit, damaged fruit. So everything should be hand sorted here to ensure high quality fruit. Fruit's destemmed, and then it goes into open topped wooden fermenters. Fermentation's going on here with the indigenous yeast. In fact, they pride themselves on adding nothing. There's a chemical-free regime in the vineyard, and similarly there are no additions in the winery. With the open top fermenters, it's possible to do a punch down every 4 hours throughout the period of fermentation, and in that way the extraction of colours, tannins and flavours can be very carefully managed. The skins stay in the vats for 3 weeks. The vats are drained, and then the skins are put into a basket press where they're gently pressed to produce a press wine that can then be retained and perhaps used in blending at a later stage. The wine goes into oak barrels. These are French Nevers oak barrels. I'm assuming that production for this is similar to the way the wine's currently made, in which case that would be 100% of new oak and then for at least a year. So quite a straightforward approach to the winemaking, and very much as you might do in a small estate somewhere in Pomerol or Sant'Emilio. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? The initial impression I get from the colour is of a mature wine. I'm looking at something which is brick red. I mean, although there is a ruby note to the redness at the core, the wine is becoming paler, noticeably paler towards the rim. Swirling the wine only has 12.5% alcohol. I mean, I think the point was because there was a lot of cloud cover throughout the summer, the sugar levels didn't get as high as they might normally do in Matakana. So let's see what we make of the aroma, shall we? Gosh, the aromas are mature, they're complex, they're really very attractive. There are all sorts of notes there. It's really quite sort of high-toned. You have notes that are akin to prune, certainly. There are mushroom notes. There's a sort of a rich, almost sort of raisin sultana note of dried fruit there, like sort of rich fruit cake note. There are notes of licorice that I think stem initially from notes of forest floor, but the sort of the dried leaves notes soon become much more ripe and rich, and they become that sort of note. You've almost got notes of dried fig here, notes of rose petals. In fact, the sort of classic Barolo tar note here is alongside those petals there. There's plenty going on. This is a very mature wine. So let's have a taste, shall we? On the palate, there's a warm red fruit note. There's a certain degree of freshness, and then once you get past juicy, high-toned, delicate, almost raspberry and rose petal notes, you start to get that sort of rich licoriciness, sweetness. The wine's not actually sweet, but there's a sort of a Pontefract cake sort of licoricey note there. There's a very, very smooth, silky texture, and then you get a sort of a dusty, drying graphite sort of note, and again a smoothness and a very smooth texture on the mid palate there. And the finish is leaving some of that sort of graphite note, and yet there are still some of those lifted perfume, rose petal, peony sort of notes on the back palate. There's a lot here that actually reminds me of very old Bordeaux, sort of something from the early 80s from Pomerol or Sant'Emilio. There are earthy notes, and yet there's a sort of a rich sweetness to the fruit. The wine isn't actually sweet, but it's so smooth and rounded with a juiciness. I mean, the acidity doesn't stand out, but it's clearly lifting the fruit very nicely. The alcohol's not intruding. The tannins, incredibly fine tannins, are actually eventually giving quite a drying grip. It's not drying out the finish unpleasantly. It's a wine at full maturity. It's unlikely to decline rapidly. There's a structure here, and the fruit intensity has enabled it to last and be showing some beautiful, clean, developed fruit. The acidity is clearly managing to keep it fresh. The alcohol is sufficient that the wine is stable. I think it's a wine that could challenge some people, but actually it's wonderfully textured. It's still got life and freshness, and actually I suspect it would probably last in the bottle for 4 or 5 years, because it doesn't seem to be infirm or in decline. As I say, the place I've encountered wines like this before was tasting old Bordeaux. And it does remind me of sort of old wines I've had from places like Trotte-Vieille or Petit Village. And one I found incredibly interesting, and one that I think I'm pleasantly surprised by. Thank you very much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, do please press the like button. Do consider signing up and following us on YouTube. It would be fantastic to have your support. If you have any feedback, please leave that in the box below. We'd love to know what you think of the wines, we're looking at, the tastings we're doing, or anything else related to that. There's a link below to the Wine Searcher website to help you find this wine, to find out more about its cost and where it might be available. I'm afraid it probably is largely available only in New Zealand. It's not a wine that's widely distributed internationally, but I hope you'll forgive us for that. If you have any friends you think might be interested in watching the video, please do feel free to forward it to them. But most importantly, do please try and find some time and come and join us for another tasting in the very near future, won't you? Thanks again. Bye for now.